My name is Giselle Massi. I'm a former journalist and the author of the book We Are Here for a Purpose, How to Find Yours. In 2007, I created a new series of exceptional conversation taped at the Dairy Center for the Arts in Boulder, Colorado. Tonight's presentation features my friend John Meredith, who has a fascinating spiritual journey to share. He is also included in a chapter in my book.
This is John Meredith, my friend. I first met John at the Denver Post when I was TV Week editor. John was doing freelance writing, also writing a column for the Denver Post with specialties in wine, food, dining, travel. Instantly, we knew that we were kindred spirits. We had no idea where our friendship was going to take us. That was 1986. Since then, I've written a book, We Are Here for a Purpose, How to Find Yours. John is featured in one of the chapters of the book, and I've invited him here to the SALON ONE speaking event so that he can share his journey, a very unique tale. He will explore the possibilities, if you're willing to join him on this journey of past lives and a continuation of our soul. John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we will have questions and answers later.
The story I'm going to relate to you is of the journey of a soul, a journey that spans 2 centuries. It's a story that you're not likely to have encountered before, but should you find yourself on familiar ground here, so much the better. I have on occasion over the past 25 or 30 years told this story to a relative handful of people. But in early 2002, I set about the task of researching and writing it all down, a process which took the remainder of that year. This is the first time I've related or discussed this story in a public forum, and I would ask that you only keep your mind open to the possibility. My story begins on a sultry afternoon in the summer of 1955, when I was 6, sitting on the floor of my paternal grandparents' parlor in St. Louis, Missouri, leafing through the pages of a large book. The book, full of color and black and white illustrations, was about a great battle that was fought many years ago in a place called Waterloo. The volume contained graphic depictions of scenes from the conflict, as painted or drawn by eyewitnesses, as well as modern photographs of the area. I became transfixed by these images of battle, and of one image in particular, a depiction of what I later learned was the defense of the main gate of Hougoumont, a small farm built on the edge of the battlefield. I was drawn to a single figure in that image, a soldier leaning hatless and wounded against a stone wall, a saber in one hand. In a matter of moments, and without any explanation, I began to hear the din of battle, the cries, the shouts, the reports of muskets, the cannons roar, and smell the aroma of gunpowder. I could not take my eyes from this scene or blot out the sounds. Suddenly, and without warning, I was that soldier leaning against that wall in his body, aware of the chaos around me, yet with a sense that I was somehow separate from it. Though in a weakened state, with wounds to my shoulder and hip, I managed to lead a handful of soldiers through a breach in the wall and into the garden of Hougoumont. Due to the shelling and musket smoke, visibility was poor. After assessing our situation, I sensed that I had miscalculated, that it was only a matter of moments then before we were set upon by British grenadiers. In short order, we were cornered and were shot and bayoneted into oblivion. Moments later, as my life seeped out of me, I was aware of a force of some kind, pushing me up and out of my body. I had a sense of being a disembodied presence above the courtyard, looking down and on and drawing away from my now lifeless body and the fight that raged below. The sounds, the smells were drifting away. I looked down upon what appeared to be a silent movie. My pain was gone, and though my body was mixed in among the other living and lifeless forms below, something of me, my mind, seemed to still be alive. As I floated higher, I felt a pulling sensation that was taking me further away from the battlefield. A few more moments passed, and I was high above vineyards and orchards in the south of France, a place I had known well. A young woman was tending the fields surrounding a farmhouse, her 2 young children nearby. This was my family, the family that would not see me again. I hovered above them, trying to communicate somehow that I was not really gone, that they hadn't lost me forever, and that they would see me again when the time came. My wife stopped working for a moment and looked off into the distance, to the north, the direction in which I had gone to fight some 5 years before. She seemed to sense my presence and to somehow understand. I moved away once again. My surroundings darkened at first and then lightened into a sort of gray without really being a color at all. The gray gradually became almost white, but was really more the absence of color. I became aware of passing through a portal, of being summoned to a place. I then passed through layers or strata of what I would describe as a combination of energy and light, all appearing in varying degrees of whiteness. There was a resonance of some kind, a vibration similar to a humming, but with a tonal quality not unlike a tuning fork. I felt the power of thought all around me, thoughts of love, of companionship, of empathy, of understanding, an understanding of who I was and why I was here. I could feel other spirits around, many of whom had been close to me in previous lifetimes, spirits that I recognized, though I could not see them in any conventional way. There was a pervasive feeling of tranquility and well-being, of community, of belonging. I was approached by my spirit guide, a feminine presence who communicated to me that this is where I would reside until I chose to return to earth in physical form once again. And then as I reviewed my life, that life just ended, I would see that it had run its intended course. The only way I can describe the review of which I spoke is that my entire previous life passed before me in detail, from my birth to the moment I stood wounded against that wall in Belgium in June of 1815. I was one of fraternal twins, born to the Comte and Comtesse de Rochechouart, members of the French court in Paris, France in November 1788. Christened Honoré de Rochechouart, I was inexplicably separated from my family at the age of 8 months during its evacuation of Paris following the storming of the Bastille. Found by one of the Rochechouart's attendants, one Anne-Marie Thirion, I was spirited away to the south of France. She changed my name to Augustin, as it was the month of August when we arrived at our destination, and raised me as her own. We were taken in by Anne-Marie's sister and her husband, who owned and operated a successful farm and vineyard. As a young man, I was an excellent student. From the age of 12, I worked hard as a farmhand and laborer for my uncle, eventually keeping the books for his business. In the autumn of 1806, just a month before my 18th birthday, I married a fair young woman named Marguerite Girardin. As a wedding present, my uncle gave us a small portion of farmland and vineyard that belonged to his family, the Tachons, who continue to make wine in the province today. Before long, we were the parents of 2 fair-haired children, Jean-Marie, born in 1808, and Francois, who arrived in 1809. The following year, I joined the French army with the rank of corporal as a rifleman in the light infantry. It was a difficult time to leave my home and family for an unknown period, but at least I knew that they were in good hands, with my mother and aunt to look after them and my uncle to tend our vineyard. Besides, service in Le Grand Armée du Nord was a great honor, and it satisfied the boyish impulse to don elegant uniforms and strike out in search of adventure and glory. In September of 1812, less than 2 years after my enlistment, I was promoted to sergeant and fought in the Battle of Borodino. In one of the bloodiest battles of the War of 1812, the French army suffered nearly 30,000 casualties. It was a horrific experience, and I was twice wounded. Despite the loss, Napoleon pressed on to Moscow, razing the city. Our return march to Paris, for the worst winter in decades, took a severe toll. I was one of only 30,000 out of a force of 600,000 to survive. I remained on active duty during 1813, having been promoted to sergeant major. In October, I fought in and survived the Battle of Leipzig, though not without additional wounds. I mustered out the following year after Napoleon's exile to the Isle of Elba, and was on my way home when I was attacked, beaten severely, and left for dead by highwaymen on a road southeast of Paris. There I was discovered by a young woman whose family operated a roadhouse in a nearby village, and spent several months recovering in a room above that roadhouse. Finally, I set off on my way south to rejoin my family in March 1815, when I was intercepted by the French army, marching on Paris with the emperor at its head, following his escape from prison. I was swept up again in the emotion of Napoleon's return and joined the army once again, this time with a commission as a lieutenant in the Light Infantry Brigade, under the command of Jerome Bonaparte, the emperor's brother. For 28,000 Frenchmen, that campaign culminated in death 3 months later in a field south of the Belgian town of Waterloo. Among them was one Augustin Thirion, who never saw his vineyards, his wife, or his children again, and who never knew his true identity. It was at the height of this battle, as I leaned wounded and exhausted against that wall outside Hougoumont, that I was back on the floor of my grandmother's parlor in St. Louis, just as suddenly as I had left, with a book on my lap. It was all as if I was coming out from under some sort of spell. Though I'd been gone for a long while, it seemed, it appears as if no real time had passed at all, that I had not been missed by anyone. I knew something important and unusual had taken place, but did not, of course, understand the significance of what had happened, nor did I attach any meaning to it until quite a few years later. But that experience was powerful enough to stay with me. 6 years later, in the fall of 1961, at the age of 12, I had another experience. I was sitting in the front pew in the sanctuary of Mountain View Methodist Church here in Boulder, late one evening with fellow members of the Methodist Youth Fellowship, when quite something out of the ordinary happened. Peering up at the diamond-shaped figures of class behind and above the altar, which were clear and transparent, looking out on nothing but darkness, I saw a series of sepia-toned, ghost-like images, human figures they turned out to be, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, moving with unusual quickness. Their lips were moving, but no sounds were coming forth. It was as if I were watching a silent film. I was aware of the voices of some of my friends near me and of their hands shaking me, but I did not respond to them. I could not take my eyes from or avert my attention from the scene before me. And then their voices faded away, and I was no longer in the church, no longer in the body I knew, but, as had been the case 6 years before, in a different time and place, this time in the body of an elderly man. This man was watching the projection of moving pictures on a screen in a banquet hall filled with men who had just finished dining and were enjoying brandy and cigars in the dark as the images flickered on their faces. Before us on the screen was a middle-aged man in an apron in an apothecary shop who performed a number of magic tricks, such as bouncing a large ball without touching it and shining his shoes with a brush that moved by itself. Another film told a fantastic story of 6 astronomers who fly to the moon in a giant mortar shell where they are taken prisoner by insect-like beings. This was followed by films depicting horse-drawn and motor traffic on a London street and the funeral of cortege of Queen Victoria. The final film, a newsreel of scenes from the Boer War, drew cheers and applause from this military audience. At the conclusion of this entertainment, speeches were given and presentations were made, including one to me for my long years of service to the Crown in India, after which I was taken ill and transported by coach to my hotel. I was administered to by a physician and tended to by a nurse for several days until I was able to travel, at which point I took a train to my modest home by the sea. My housekeeper tended me there for several weeks, after which I eventually succumbed as a result of a weakened condition from some pneumonia-like malady. At the moment of my death, as before at Waterloo, I became aware that I had left my body and reposed for a while above this scene. In short order, I was on my way to the other side once again, to see kindred spirits and to evaluate my most recent terrestrial life. It was there that once again I relived my life in its entirety, from its beginning to its end some 79 years later. Born Linnaeus Tripp, the son of a surgeon in Devonport, England, in April 1822, I was reared in a large, noisy family as one of 8 children. We lived in a gabled stone house on a walled property of some size, with a wrought iron gate, a stable, a carriage house, and a formal garden. The 10 of us were looked after by a cook, a manservant, a maidservant, a housekeeper, and a carriage driver, all of whom lived, some with their own families, on the property. My father always said that I was remarkably practical as a young man, and that my intelligence and kindness rendered me incapable of taking advantage of anyone, traits that were to remain with me throughout my life. Following a rather undistinguished secondary education in southwestern England, and with my parents' support, I enlisted in the British Army at Bangalore, India, in 1839 at the age of 17. Over the ensuing years, I rose through the ranks to sergeant major, at which time I met my wife-to-be, a raven-haired English beauty with dark flashing eyes named Cassandra, whose father was stationed in India. We were married in England late the following year, and honeymooned in Egypt before returning to my station in Bangalore. Complications from childbirth, including those resulting in the death of the mother and/or the infant, were fairly common in those days. But still, I was not prepared for the loss of both my beloved Cassie and our daughter-to-be in the summer of 1848. After a month's leave, I returned to my duties with vigor, immersing myself in Army life as a way of pushing the grief from my mind. The following year, I received a commission as lieutenant. I began to study photography, familiarizing myself with the photographs and portraits of pioneers Francis Frith, Benjamin Turner, and Henry Peach Robinson. In 1851, while on furlough in London, I attended the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, which opened in Hyde Park that summer. The exhibition, later known as the First World's Fair, was the social and technological event of the decade. It was shortly after the exhibition that I met Julia Margaret Cameron through a mutual friend under whom I was studying, Charles Dodgson, who is best known for his books Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which he published under the pen name Lewis Carroll. In early 1854, I was posted to Constantinople and then on to the Crimea, where I saw my first action. But before I ever had an opportunity to engage the enemy, however, I was grievously wounded by Russian musket balls, one which struck my right knee, an injury from which I limped slightly thereafter, and one which lodged in my heart and remained there inoperable for the remainder of my days. I'd not been expected to live, but my brother Algernon, an army surgeon, was able to save me. I spent the rest of the year recovering from those wounds in London, where Julia visited me on several occasions. Over the ensuing years, Julia embarked on an adventure that brought her international renown, producing revolutionary photographs of many of the great luminaries of the mid-19th century. She and I developed a close personal and professional relationship, a friendship that remained secret, as convention in Victorian England required. our love enduring but unrequited. Her last visit to England, and the last time I saw her, came in 1878. She died the following year at the age of 63. Today, she is recognized as one of the great portrait photographers of all time. In early 1855, shortly after becoming a member of the Royal Photographic Society, I accompanied the British diplomatic mission to the Burmese court as official photographer to the Crown. Despite the injury to my knee, I lugged my camera, a heavy, unmanageable affair, from village to village, producing hundreds of landscape and architectural views of the area that subsequently garnered widespread praise. The following year, the Madras presidency appointed me its official photographer, and I was promoted to the rank of captain. Based at Bangalore, I spent 2 months each year teaching photography at the School of Industrial Arts in Madras, and the remaining months on photographic expeditions. When the position of photographer was eliminated in 1860, I set up a studio in Madras where many affluent and well-known British and Indian families came to have their pictures taken. All the while, I continued my military career, receiving promotions to major in 1861 and colonel in 1870. I was eventually posted to England and retired from the Army in 1875. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, I produced views of the English countryside for the Frith Travel Company of London. In 1879, I became acquainted with a young photographer by the name of William Freescreen, who had begun experimenting with a camera that could record movement for the intention of making moving pictures. Through most of the 1880s, I assisted him with the fits and starts of this idea, investing a portion of my income in its development. As the decade neared its end, I withdrew my support and returned to Devonshire, in part because of my distaste for the intensity of this race to invent moving pictures, and in part because of the uproar in London over the grisly murder mutilations attributed to Jack the Ripper. Several months later, Freescreen exposed 20 feet of celluloid film in Hyde Park, after which he rushed to his studio, where for the first time he projected motion pictures onto a wall. In June, he received a grant from the Patent Office for the invention, and the age of cinema was born. In a 50-year span of my cognitive life, I had witnessed both the invention of photography and the invention of motion pictures. I became a devotee of the fledgling art form that would become known as cinematography, and spent many an hour sitting in the dark, marveling, as did my fellow moviegoers, at the spectacle that unfolded before us. A Trip to the Moon, a cocktail of the fantastic, inspired by Jules Verne, was on the film program that night at the military banquet in London in December 1901, when I was taken ill. At which point I found myself in the present once again, in 1961, in my own body, in the basement of Mountain View Methodist. No more than a half hour had passed during which I lived an entire lifetime. I'd been taken downstairs from the sanctuary by a member of the church staff, who had been unable to bring me out of this trance in which I appeared to be. One of the counselors of the Methodist Youth Fellowship, an Egyptian named Abdu Abdullah, who had also been schooled in Eastern religions and mysticism, hypnotized me so that he could bring me out from under the spell and back to normal, with the post-hypnotic suggestion that the entire episode would then be forgotten. But he failed in that attempt. The powerful memory of that lifetime has remained with me in my subconscious mind to the present time. The third episode occurred at another 6-year interval in early 1967, at the age of 18. I'd gone to a local drive-in theater in Santa Maria, California, with 3 friends to see a first-run film called The Sand Pebbles. Sitting behind the wheel and not long into the film, I became aware that the events unfolding on the screen were strangely familiar to me, that I knew these people and places. and could somehow anticipate events that were unfolding in the story before they occurred. I was taken by the story to the extent that I remember little of the next 18 hours as I went about the normal business of living. My friends and family were concerned for me all the while, however, revealing to me later that I seemed to be in a trance. I had little response to questions posed to me. I apparently was able to function on a conscious level while my subconscious mind was occupied elsewhere, shall we say. Like the protagonist of the film, who was based on a sailor known to author Richard McKenna, I was born in 1902, returning to the world 5 months after I had last left it. In the fall of 1910, at the age of 8, I was enrolled in the Royal Orphanage School, a public school in the town of Wolverhampton, a suburb of Birmingham, England. My father had died 4 years before, and my mother was an invalid. She had been a teacher, a calling to which she had returned after my father's death, but one day she collapsed, and a tumor was discovered on the right side of her brain. Though surgery saved her life, her left arm and left leg became increasingly insensitive. And the winter before I entered public school, I was sent to live with my sister and her husband while mother recuperated. My years at Roz, as we called the school, merged into one another, a montage of headmasters, bad food, fistfights, canings for misbehavior, hours of reading Latin and Gaslight, and rowing on the river. I always went home for Christmas and Easter holiday, and the relatives came by to visit with mother and to find out how I was getting on. 4 years later, in 1914, the war, still unimaginable, but the vegetable garden was uprooted, and concrete air raid shelters were built. Several of the staff joined the Army or the RAF, and several schoolmasters taught our lessons in full uniform. We were all issued gas masks. When the armistice came in 1918, it produced scenes of relief and great happiness throughout the country. For most soldiers, however, the end of the war brought depression and disappointment. The average Tommy had left England a boy and returned a man, and he was none too happy about having made the transition in such an abrupt and terrible way. But to young Britons, born in the early years of the 20th century, who had never seen the front, war was an adventure, and the Far East in particular a mysterious and exotic place. Reared on a diet of Rudyard Kipling, we were imbued with romantic notions of life in the far reaches of the British Empire. Though Mother had wanted me to pursue my education, I persuaded her that it was simply not my calling. That adventure instead was my future. I finally received her permission, which was necessary at the age of 17, on condition that I not join the Army. So I enlisted in the Royal Navy instead, as a machinist's apprentice in the summer of 1919. I had traded one uniform for another. The Navy was a lot like Roz, except that I got paid for it. After 6 weeks of training and 6 more miserable months of service in the North Atlantic, I applied for a transfer to the Asiatic Fleet and shipped out to China. I arrived at Shanghai at the mouth of the Yangtze in the spring of 1920 as a machinist mate second class aboard the HMS Teal. There were 15 British gunboats in the Yangtze Patrol. Protecting British and American interests, the U.S. had only 2. I soon began taking a real interest in my work aboard ship, having discovered a secret that the Navy simply couldn't get along without machinery. And that's when I began to love engines. During the next 4 years, I routine very little. Patrols of the river with our sister ship Widgeon, protecting missionaries and other British and American interests by our presence and our propensity for sorting out disagreements. Just before Christmas, 1925, I returned to the HMS Scarab in order to accept a promotion from machinist mate to machinist. Though 1925 had been tense, 1926 would be worse, as Western guns on the Yangtze forced organized Chinese forces of greater strength under a new warlord by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. By mid-year, most of the gunboats regularly came under machine gun and rifle fire from both nationalist troops and Chinese mobs. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Wonsian, which was precipitated by an incident that occurred when the British merchant steamer SS Wonsian was boarded by a Chinese general with a detachment of his ex-bandits demanding a ride upriver. When the captain declined, the general refused to leave his cabin. Hostages were taken, and they were under threat of death if the gunboats made any provocative move. Late on the afternoon of September 5th, a British merchant ship that had been commandeered by the Royal Navy steamed alongside the Wonsian. Secreted aboard was a force of 110 British sailors and officers from the cruiser Dispatch and the gunboats Scarab and Mantis, armed with rifles and machine guns. I was among them. As the first landing party leaped aboard, it was met with heavy crossfire. In the early moments of the attack, British casualties were heavy. Then the Chinese began to fall. Commander Darley, who had been placed in charge of the operation, got off 2 shots before he was riddled with bullets. Right behind him, I opened up with an automatic rifle, taking out a half-dozen soldiers before I was hit. I managed to raise myself to a sitting position across some sandbags, where I continued firing until I was wounded again and collapsed. I lay there for a time, lapsing in and out of consciousness, until 2 seamen dragged me back to the ship. I was brought below deck with the other wounded, and though I sensed that I wasn't going to make it, my greatest concern was the impact that the news would have on Mother. I didn't want her to have to deal with this. Yet, at some point before dawn, I stopped breathing. And thus it was that machinist Frederick Farrow, engineer on His Majesty's ship Scarab, September 6, 1926, aged 24. As before, my spirit floated above the scene, above the ship and the river and the city for a while, before I was once again on my way to the other side to assess my previous existence. But just before I left the earthly sphere entirely, I paid a visit to Burslem, floating above the chimney tops until I was in our home once more. I was in the room with Mother when the telegram arrived, announcing that I had been killed in action. Through the emotion of the moment, she seemed to sense my presence and to understand that she would be seeing me again before long. And then I was back in my present body and my current existence in California on a Saturday morning in January 1967, pondering the significance of all that had gone before. 6 years more passed, and in early 1973, at the age of 24, I experienced the 4th and final episode. Emerging from a friend's apartment late one night, I failed to notice a large wooden beam protruding from the roof overhanging an outside hallway, and I struck the end of the beam full on with my forehead. I lost consciousness almost immediately and was carried back inside the apartment and laid on a sofa. As in some of my previous episodes, I began to see and hear and smell the scene of a battle. In short order, I was in the body of a young soldier, a British paratrooper, fighting in France following the invasion of Normandy. It was August 22nd, 1944. On that afternoon, my mate and I were in our foxhole when an officer came around and said there would be action that night. We'd been under heavy shell fire many times since the invasion had begun, and we knew it was coming. When the guns opened up, casualties were heavy, and I could hear men calling for medics. I was weighed down by my pack, by ammunition, by my entrenching tool, by wet clothing. It was almost dark, and the smoke was so thick I couldn't see 10 yards. As I clambered from the trench, a shell burst close by and knocked me to the ground. After a couple of minutes, I realized that I'd been badly wounded in the left leg, so I managed to wrap a piece of field dressing around it to staunch the bleeding. But I couldn't walk, so another wounded chap and I began to crawl toward the rear. Before we had gone far, however, another shell hit right next to me with great force, and I was hurled some distance. Upon landing, I lost consciousness. How long I lay there, I don't know. But at some point, I was aware that I was in a stretcher, being carried by two men. And then I drifted away, and my spirit was above the scene, looking down on two soldiers bearing my body through the shelling to a field hospital. I watched as they set the stretcher down, and the doctor leaned over me. The doctor then straightened up and motioned for the soldiers to take the body away. The sounds and carnage faded, and I found myself inside my childhood home by the sea once more, in the presence of Mom and Dad and my brother and sister, before I was once again on my way through the layers of energy to the spirit world, whereas before I reviewed my life in detail. I was born Murray Adams Acton in the spring of 1927, just a few months after my previous life had ended in China, in the village of Heath in County Kent on the southeastern coast of England. My father, Lionel, was a barber, and my mother, Dorothy, worked part-time in a confectionery shop or took in laundry on the side to help support my younger brother, Ronnie, my sister, Kat, and me. We had a bungalow only a 5-minute walk from the sea. No one I knew, us included, had a car. And my father and I would often pick up tackle after school and fish from the pier for that evening's supper. The front of our house was a screened sun porch, festooned with honeysuckle, where we usually took tea. In the side garden, there was a pond with goldfish. On summer evenings, my father would don his old-fashioned striped blazer and straw hat, and we'd walk along the quay, tossing stones into the English Channel. Or we'd sit by the radio listening to Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey performances, broadcasts from America. We believed we were ready for the news, but it was still a shock when on September 3rd, 1939, an old man's voice on the radio told us that we were at war with Germany. I was 12 years old. Over the following months, we saw shipping being hit by mines in the Channel. We're often kept awake at night by artillery duels in France, and were witness to the air battles when the Luftwaffe tried to destroy the radar towers in Dover. When our troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, we went down to the beach in Folkestone and gave them hot tea, sandwiches, and cigarettes. The town was always full of British soldiers. Most every home round there was billeted with uniformed lodgers off and on during the war, and ours was no exception. Between early 1941 and Christmas 1942, the 10th Battalion of the regiment known as the Green Howards were stationed at Heath, and several soldiers stayed with us during that period. The air was rich with lively conversation late into the night, and as we engaged in endless card games with guys with names like Lefty, Dusty, Ginger, and Pop. By the time they all departed, I'd taken a real liking to these men. My older brothers, as I came to think of them. I came to feel that I might be one of them, that I belonged, you could say. As I mounted the stairs on Christmas night in 1942, I stopped and I looked back into the room, a sea of faces in the smoke. These Green Howards were wearing paper hats and streamers. Other boys, brothers, and fathers sitting around our table wishing it was their son or brother they had just bid goodnight. I knew right then that I wanted to be one of the Green Howards. And in the spring of 1943, just after my 16th birthday, I petitioned Mom and Dad to allow me to join up. My father, having enlisted at an early age himself during the Great War, understood my desire, but my mother was opposed. I was asked to wait another year, but I was determined to go, and I finally convinced Mom. A week later, I packed a bag bade goodbye to everyone, and took a bus to the 10th Battalion headquarters, where I enlisted in the Green Howards and was kitted out in khakis with blankets, pack, and rifle. After 6 weeks of strenuous training, I passed muster and received the coveted Green Beret. In May 1943, the 10th Battalion was selected for conversion into a parachute battalion. Henceforth, we would wear the badge of the Paras and the airborne insignia of the mythical warrior Bellerophon, astride his winged horse, Pegasus. Planning for the invasion of Europe began that summer, with a target date of sometime in May 1944, the earliest that forces could be equipped and ready to go. The target date became known as D-Day, and the campaign was designated Operation Overlord. For the invasion, our brigade was to be flown into France and dropped by glider. In the spring of '44, we were posted to regimental headquarters in Aldershot, west of London, where our training intensified as we approached D-Day. 2 weeks later, the battalion moved to Surrey, south of London, for final preparations. All outgoing mail stopped. We were confined to camp and put on a state of high alert. The invasion was scheduled to begin in the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, but was postponed 24 hours due to poor visibility. Just after midnight on June 6th, our aircraft took off, heading for the designated drop zone in Normandy. After a bumpy ride across the channel, we parachuted into France near Ranville and took the bridge over the Orne without opposition. Throughout the day, we were under constant machine gun and sniper fire. By nightfall, however, the entire division was deployed and in action. During the next 100 days, the division accomplished every objective it was given. Despite a series of German counterattacks and under withering machine gun and mortar fire and the occasional strafing, the shield we put up on the British flank was never broken. One night I had a dream that I was standing in a foxhole, and at eye level there were feet marching feet going by, and they were the feet of all the men I had known since the Napoleonic campaigns who had died in combat. And they were marching away into the distance where I could not follow. All of my old comrades had gone, and I alone was left behind. It was not long after that night that August 22nd arrived, bringing with it artillery shells that spelled the end for 3 soldiers of 12 Para: Jock Gilbert, Anthony Rabbits, and Demi. The end came outside the village of Pont-l'Evêque in Normandy, a village some 200 miles southwest of another village in southern Belgium called Waterloo. Though I had and still have vivid recollections of my first and second episodes at ages 6 and 12, it was not until the time of my third episode at the age of 18 that I began to comprehend their implications. By that time I was aware that I'd been given access to this information for some purpose. There had to be some grand design behind these experiences that I was to uncover and carry out. Part of that design became very clear to me 3 years later, when at the age of 21 I was given a physical exam as a prelude to my induction into the United States Army. It was 1970. The Vietnam War was at full throttle, and my lottery number was 108, which meant that I was certain to be called up. And I was just as certain that I could not serve in combat under any circumstances. Since I had been out of college for 1 semester in the autumn of '69, during which time I had worked while transferring from the University of California to the University of Colorado, I lost my student deferment. And that was sufficient reason for selective service to reclassify me 1A. Despite my efforts to the contrary, I related this story to an Army psychologist and applied for status as a conscientious objector. I passed the physical and was given a green light for induction. I decided that I could not and would not accept induction. My choice was to report for induction when the time came and refuse. A refusal that would earn me a 2-year sentence in a minimum security facility. But it was preferable to taking the lives of others, which I had done on many occasions before and was determined not to repeat. I was not afraid of dying for my country. I wanted to live for my country for a change. Once I made my decision, I informed my advisor in the university's theater department, where I had my major, that I would not be able to finish the term, that I was going to face induction shortly and would refuse. Dr. Reynolds wrote a letter to my draft board in Santa Barbara, and 3 days before my scheduled induction, I received a letter reclassifying me 1H, which meant that I was only to be called up in time of national emergency. I don't know even now the contents of that letter, but on that day, a great weight was lifted from me. I had made the decision to finally break the 160-year-long cycle of the taking of life, and I had finally prevailed. At the age of 21, I had achieved my primary purpose in life, my reason for being. But it was certainly not the only reason. The issues of families and loved ones left behind remain partially unresolved. And I continue to work to address those issues through the relationships I have with those closest to me. Spirits with which I have a long history in the time I have remained. Yes, I still have a long way to go. But I'm surrounded by extraordinary people. And in that, I am blessed beyond measure. Some have found support in this story for their philosophical opinions and beliefs. Others have considered it to be a series of subjective tales that smack of science fiction. And some have contended that I have merely dreamed or imagined these events. Could it be? Is it possible that it all happened just as I have described it? Or is it a flight of fancy, wishful thinking, the product of my conscious mind? Of my answer to these questions, there is no doubt. Your conclusion might differ from mine. But should you find that you ultimately cannot accept either the premise or the reality of this journey, well, it's still one hell of a story, isn't it? Thank you.
What fascinates me about the story, and did from the moment that I met John, I understood that he understood something that I have lived with all my life, which was a knowingness that there was more to my own life. And my father, when he began coming to me after his death in 1992, I was looking for someone else who had some understanding of this continuation of the soul. And as my relationship with John developed over the years, and his story and his awareness of his story became even more and more clear to him, we began to deepen our understanding of the role that we had in this life. To certain degrees, we think of ourselves as messengers with different purposes. I felt it was so important to have John's story be shared, and that's why I put him in the book. I wanted people to have an understanding that we could take the lessons of our current life and build on them. We don't always have to look back. Would you agree, John, that it's not necessary to have the detail of your past life?
The critical issue for me in the beginning, when I first started to tell this, and that took a while for me to come to the point where I was willing to tell the story to someone else. Certainly, had I done that when I was 18, I think that it not only would have been incomplete as to my understanding of it, but I don't know that it would have been received very well. The important and most critical issue, I think, in relating a story like this or discussing spirituality in many forms is the willingness of someone to keep their mind open to possibility. That's the biggest roadblock, I think, in getting people to the point where they actually hear what you're saying is keeping things open to the possibilities. Because we were all raised with certain philosophies in certain families that most of us didn't question for many, many years, in spite of other experiences.
Or don't even allow for the discussion.
Right, don't even allow for the discussion.
They shut it down, or they're afraid of it. And I know when I first met John and we had gone to lunch, and John began to start parts of his story. You didn't tell me the entire story at that lunch. It would have gone on. We would have never returned to the office. But the essence of what I took away that first time we really opened up about our soul journey was he understood I had the ears to hear what he had learned and what he wanted to share. And in the work that I do, I'm always hoping to find people that are willing to hear, even if they have not entertained the possibility before. Sometimes just giving them a venue, a beginning, as I gave you to tell me the story. I said, I welcomed him. Do you find that as you've come along the last few years, are you finding more people that are open to listening to this, or less inclined to listen?
I think more people, definitely, and I think it's a general progression in the culture that we live in over 30 or 40 or 50, certainly 50 years ago, but over the last couple of decades, I've seen more and more interest in spirituality and the tales that people have. I'm sometimes asked why I have had these experiences and so many other people have not. I don't really have an answer for that. I've met other people who have similar experiences, maybe not to the extent that mine is, but we're covering the kind of span of time that mine does. But certainly there are more people who are willing to discuss those experiences or try to figure out what exactly they mean. What kind of an experience was it?
At what point, as you recalled these past lives, at what point did you realize you needed to start analyzing it or interpreting it beyond just the visual that was given to you?
I think it was after the third one. I may have even been anticipating something happening because it had been at 6-year intervals. And why it came at 6, 12, 18, 24, there isn't any logical reason for that. But after I turned 18, then I was aware that there might be something else that would happen. And so maybe my subconscious was more open to the possibility of it happening. So that when the catalyst, in each instance here, there was a catalyst which set off the experience or the episode. And so maybe my subconscious was more open to whatever catalyst was going to take it in that direction.
And I want to ask you about the time between the lives. At any point, do you have any a memory or a scent of knowingness that you had to come back, that you were being sent back to do this atonement, so to speak?
My understanding is and was that it was always a personal decision to come back, influenced by other spirits who were there and are with us throughout not just our lives, but on the other side as well.
Almost like giving you a focus. Mm-hmm. So when you were having your life reviews, there was a sense, a presence that you were being helped to see what you needed to see?
To see and experience what you need to see, and hopefully to retain that information. And that's the most difficult part of it, is retaining the information after you come back. And there's a good reason for that. We have to, I think the mind is set up so that when the spirit enters the body at birth, there has to be an amnesia about the spirit and the knowledge that it has and the knowledge that is retained in the subconscious. Otherwise, children would have all of these experiences running through their head
With
at all
no
times
memory.
and couldn't separate reality of the moment from what happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or you're not my mother, I have a different mother, and things like that. And so there has to be an amnesia about the in the subconscious that blocks the conscious, blocks the mind from that information going into the consciousness.
That makes total sense to me, John.
In my instance, I think that when my nervous system had completed its growth pattern, that was not, that shield or that block wasn't completely effective, and some of this information came through into my conscious mind, and that made it possible with a catalyst at 6 years old for this episode to take place. That's the logical explanation I have.
So it's also important to understand then that you don't have to create the moment for this experience to come to you. You don't have to be in a quiet meditative state. You could just be living your life, and all that seemed to be necessary to get to the place where you could make that decision, that fateful decision, not to be inducted, to not accept it, to refuse.
For me, that was the point at which I received the information. It was up to me to do something with it or about it. And so
that was the moral stand that had to be made in order for you to fulfill and complete the journey on that level. That's how I would look at it.
For all of those episodes to make sense, that I was given that information and that I re-experienced them, that's the logical conclusion that I came to at the time.
John, again, I can't thank you enough, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share your story with whoever has the ears to hear.
Thanks, Giselle.